You know, in working with numerous families, what I've realized is that when you do estate planning, most people think that estate planning is really just about the documents. You know, we've kind of talked about before having a will set up and having a trust set up and making sure that everything is handled efficiently, either one when you're disabled or, of course, upon death. What's really been intriguing to me, though, as I've worked with numerous families, is that estate planning really takes on more of a mission as you move into generational planning. And when I think about generational planning, I really, as I reflected through all the years working with families, I always come back to a couple really pivotal moments. And probably the first pivotal moment is I sit down with a father or a mother in their latter days, and they always come in and they say, "God, will you really help me handle the stuff?" And it's always about the stuff. Now, the stuff to most people is their assets, of course, their brokerage accounts, and maybe the country home, and maybe the timeshare in Hawaii. And that's always what they want to make sure they hand off efficiently to the next generation. And that is very, very important as you deal with estate planning. But I've always noticed there's this desire to do more for the family. And I really could never quantify it. And then the next pivotal moment is mom and dad have passed away. And normally we're 30, 45 days later. And I'm sitting down with the kids. So let's assume I've got a brother and a sister. And we're sitting across the table and we're starting to communicate. And that's normally when the conflicts come into play.
If there's conflicts between the siblings, is it really about the stuff?
And what really comes down to is brother is saying, well, mom came to more of your dance recitals than she came to my football games. And it always seems to come back to the lack of the blessing or the lack of the affirmation. One of the interesting things in working with the families is as I continue to see these patterns, I really feel like the Lord laid on my heart that there were some reasons for this. And out of that really came the book that I wrote in dealing with legacy and dealing with heritage.
Guy, what is the difference between legacy and heritage? Aren't they the same?
Heritage is our lineage right of what we should receive from our parents. We all have a lineage right of what we should receive. So let's talk about that. We understand we're going to get the old Ford pickup. Maybe we'll get the golf clubs from Dad, and maybe we'll get to China and those type of things. And those are all great. But we also receive traditions from our parents. We also receive characteristics from our parents. We also receive some form of values from our parents, because that's when we start learning values from a family perspective.
What happens if our parents lived lives with values and characteristics that we don't want to emulate?
How do you break that cycle into the next generation? One of the things I like to talk about is you can actually prune your family tree. You take the positive that you've received from a mother and a father, which is your heritage, and you can actually prune that into the next generation, because really the assumption is we all go over and we start a separate family tree coming out of our parents' family tree. So pruning's healthy. So that's really what heritage is the lineage right of what you should receive. Legacy is what we will actually leave to the next generation. How do you get legacy and heritage to align? So let's talk about legacy for a second. Legacy to me really breaks down into accepting the heritage from your parents, being able to prune what you need to prune to carry forward, and then being able to identify vision of what you want the next generation to receive, the values that you believe you would like the next generation to carry on, what relationships that you want to honor and cherish into the next generation, and then you deal with the stuff. There is a difference between heritage and legacy. So as we continue to age, I think most people have a desire, I want to leave my legacy to the next generation, but I think very few people actually define what legacy is for the next generation. Even though I had the history, I didn't quite understand what motivates people to this emotion of really wanting to leave to the next generation. God actually took me to Genesis, and I just happened to open up, and I started with the story of Abraham. In chapter 11 at the end of Genesis, Abraham is sitting in Haran. His dad had got called to Canaan, and as a family they stopped in Haran. Well, Dad was a little fleshly and everything, and Abraham, being the faithful son, stayed. Father passes away. God goes into the call to Abraham, and he calls him into Canaan. And if you actually look in chapter 12, 1 through 3, it's very specific. He calls him in and is telling him he will make a great nation of him, and he will give him specific land. As I kept looking at that, I kept saying, well, God, what does that have to do with me? Well, if you continue through, you get into the covenant of Abraham, actually in chapter 17. God is very specific, telling him that he is going to give him not only land, he's also going to give him a great blessing, and that all nations will come from him, and that his next generations will be fruitful. Now, my wife and I, we've only got 2 daughters. As I sat back and I thought through that, I said, fruitful. I'm thinking multiplication from coming out of my tree. But then I started realizing in my life, and maybe it's different in your life, that fruitfulness takes on different forms. So for me, I realized when I work with other people, or I mentor, or I encourage, that can actually be part of the fruit that God has given me the opportunity to go out and actually plant and harvest. So that really got me excited. So then God actually took me to Galatians, and if you go to Galatians chapter 3, and actually in 7 and 9, it says, if you are in Christ, then you can have the same Abrahamic covenant as what Abraham had. So then I go back and I started looking, okay, blessings. So I get blessings from God. I get the promise of fruitfulness. I get the promise of having generations after me. And that was exciting. As God prepared me to write this book, I knew I had the experiences of working with numerous families throughout my career professionally. And I knew I continued to see these patterns, but I wanted something from His Word that would substantiate what I believe was starting to happen within family trees. Abraham and God enter to a covenant. God comes to him and says, I'm going to enter to a covenant with you. You will be the father of all nations. You will be fruitful. You will be blessed. And I have specific land for you. Now, land can be a literal form. It can actually be land. Land can also be opportunities, is what I'm starting to understand in my own walk. I'd like to talk to you about fruitfulness for a minute. You know, in my own life, I have 2 daughters. And so when I started thinking about fruitful, okay, yeah, I have 2 daughters, and maybe they have 2 kids each. And when you get down, maybe if I get 4 generations down, maybe there's 40 people coming out of my family tree. But what God really taught me as I went through this journey is fruitfulness takes on a different form. He puts people in my life that every day that I can have impact into. Now, impact is being maybe an encourager, maybe being a great listener. So as I've continued to take this truth into my own life and my own walk, I've noticed that fruitfulness becomes a different version for me, which means I can have a numerous tree and be fruitful. Maybe not from a literal perspective with numerous kids, but from a spiritual perspective with spiritual brothers and sisters. That excites me. So as I started sharing this back with other families, I'm really just trying to help them understand that with this covenant, we can actually utilize this in our own family tree. Now, why is that possible? Well, you have to go to Galatians. In Galatians 3, verse 7 and verse 9, it's actually telling us, Paul is saying, that if you're in Christ, then you get to receive the Abrahamic covenant. And everything the covenant has for Abraham, we get to receive also. And I went, wow. Because you start looking at that. This is the father of all nations. This is the man God blessed. He had numerous family. He had numerous servants. He had cattle among all cattle. And God put His blessing upon him. And I think this is where we miss it today within our families. A while ago, we talked a little bit about conflict. What happens in the latter, the 30 days, 45 days after mom or dad pass away. And conflict is a reality in most families. But the reason it's a reality is very simple. And this is something I love to discuss also. It really goes back to the lack of the blessing or the lack of the affirmation. And so blessing is something that God has given us. He blesses us. And here's the problem. What a lot of people will do with blessing is they will capture it. They will hang on to it, but they won't pass it on. So even in my own family, even though I know my mother and my father loved me, I was really never blessed. I was really never affirmed. I can accelerate 50 years later. How does that play out in my life? If I don't deal with that lack of blessing and affirmation from a physical father, I will continue to pass that on to my children. And the last thing I want to do is pass that on to my children. So what I've tried to do is within my own family is learn to prune. Where I go in, and not that my parents were bad, God gave me those parents, but to understand that He wants me to bless. He wants me to affirm not only my literal children, but other people also. And so that's one way to come back and heal the hurt that is in a lot of families. And hurt really is an issue. And if you want to make sure you have a healthy family tree, then we've got to go back to the issues of what's causing the pain.
Guy, you spoke to leaving a non-financial legacy to your family. What's that look like? How do you build that out or develop that so you can put that into action as we move forward in life?
So how do you take in your own individual situation and set up your family to where you can leave the most influential legacy? What I've tried to do is identify a process that every family can do that within their own family tree. So the first thing that I have everyone do is go back and really look at what have I received from my parents. So we deal with heritage. You have to get very clear on the positive that you want to take from your family tree, from your parents, to maintain that within your current family tree. So we talk about heritage. Now, yes, for the ladies, we're going to deal with well, what are we getting from China and the heirlooms, and those are all important. The family Bible. My mom brought me years ago. I was not raised in a influential family per se, but they brought me just some mementos from 100 years ago and put it in a nice frame. That meant a lot to me because that's part of my heritage. I can see my great-great-grandfather working in a livery stable. I've got my grandfather's ring in there. I was named after an Uncle Guy. I've got something of him within that frame. So that is important. Those are important things. But the stuff is just one component, as we talked about. What values do you want to keep that mom and dad emulated to you? What vision did they have? What characteristics are positive? Work ethic, faith, those type of things. Those are very important. So I always really try to help families figure out, okay, what from our heritage is important we want to carry forward. After we deal with heritage, the next thing is we all have them, but most people really haven't written it down, is the values. What values do you live your life out today? Because we all have values, but the issue is when we all get astray with either bad attitudes or disagreements, whatever it is, what I found in my life is it's really my core values. I'm not living out that core value. Or maybe I need to go back and sharpen a value that I say that I truly want to live out. So as a family, you really do want to go identify this is what from a mother and father we believe, and we would want to communicate to you children, this is what's important to us. And now, at the same time, there might be a value or two there that's not important to them. But that's okay. At least you have communicated this is who we are and what we're about. Very important one is vision. What vision do you have for your children? Now, I'm not saying from a perspective of you got to be a football player or you got to be a doctor. It's just when you look at their gifts, God has honed us all so uniquely that when you look at the gifts, helping them to identify what those gifts are and how to utilize those gifts effectively within the kingdom. So having the vision to not only look at their gifts, but to cast forward to say, you will be great in God's kingdom, because remember, our family has been blessed because of the Abrahamic covenant. Teaching that covenant is not just a Bible story. Teaching that covenant is something we can truly capture and pass on to the next generation. So that's where the vision comes into play, helping them understand God has a purpose and a place for you within this family. Relationships, really dealing with relationships. Now, we talked about conflict, but it's not only family relationships, professional relationships. Maybe the attorney, maybe your golfing buddy, maybe your hunting buddy, whatever it is. Those are relationships that I definitely want my children to understand, to honor and respect, to remember how important those relationships are, not only within my generation, but within the next generation. It's by no accident that God puts us together. And that's what relationships do. They help to encourage, they help to put back into us. And so I want to make sure within my family tree, as I think we all do, to make sure we communicate why those relationships are important and they help shape who we are in our life. And then yes, I have in the fifth step, I actually have a process to deal with the stuff. You know, we do have to deal with the stuff. The only thing I professionally I can tell you, the stuff is what paralyzes every family. Mom and dad pass away, and when you start pulling the stuff out of the closets, that what happens is everybody gets paralyzed. So there are things that we want to keep, there are things we want to give away, and there are things that we want to sell. But the other thing I would suggest is I do this through a family life plan. It's a written plan that I help every family actually get, you know, to that form. Then we hand it out to all family members. Now, if you have minors within your family, they're probably not at that place to have that conversation. But as they move up and they move into their 20s, at least to have a conversation of we've done our planning, but then besides just the assets, I want to talk to you about the vision, the values, the relationships, and the heritage. As we work with families putting together their family life plan, our goal is to really help them to identify, you know, the vision, the values, the relationships, and the heritage, and of course deal with the stuff. But that is what can make a difference going into the next generation.